Hey YouTube, JoBoy here. So, One Piece chapter 1140 is out. If you guys haven't checked out that chapter yet, I suggest that you do so because I will be spoiling you. But now that you have, let's begin. I have a feeling this chapter might be disappointing to some for a number of reasons. Definitely some strange choices on Oda's part. At the same time, there seems to be a whole bunch of little clues in this chapter, which just beg questions, like WTF man vibes. But yeah, for the first time in a long time, I want to talk about the cover story, because I've been following along and I've been enjoying it recently, actually, but I haven't had much to say. But I feel like it cannot be ignored this week. If you guys recall, the whole identity of the Beast Pirates was like Animal Kingdom, the strongest survive. Darwinism manifested. It kind of felt like Kaido encouraged infighting just to see, look, who's the man? That's how you'd get promoted. Well, now that Kaido and his commanders are defeated, it seems like who's who is in fact that guy. He's got Ulti tied up to a pseudo dartboard and is flinging swords at her. So I'm a hazard to guess that they fought and who's who won. But yeah, outside of the entertainment value of it, all of the cover stories actually have a purpose in the grander scheme of the narrative. We've had a bunch of them at this point in time. The events in the cover story ends up becoming relevant to things that happen later on, and that's kind of what I've been biding my time waiting for here with Yamato. Where exactly is this story going? What is the point of it? Now I feel like I know the answer to that question. The whole philosophy of the Beast Pirates is that the strongest rules. Likely what is going to happen next is Yamato is going to defeat who's who, and then we will see the entirety of the Beast Pirates, those that remain, the entirety of them join Wano or become allies of the Strides. Essentially, this becomes Yamato's crew, which is actually fitting if you think about it, because Yamato is the daughter of Kaido, so this is in effect her birthright. But yeah, I'm not looking to upset people, but given what's happening right now, I think that you should prepare yourself that Yamato probably is not a legitimate member of the Stride crew. If this is really where the cover story is going, that Yamato defeats the Beast Pirates and becomes their king, then that would set her up to be the captain of the Beast Pirates, which is way more similar to a member of the Grand Fleet. But yeah, I'm sure that there's gonna be some people out there that have this thought of aren't the Beast Pirates too evil to be a member of the Stride Grand Fleet in any capacity? But I think this focus on who's who right now as being the leader it's kind of telling. Because who's who was also a guy who seemed to believe in the sun god Nika. And on the low-key, I think that Kaido was also somebody who wanted to believe in Nika and wanted to destroy the world in a very similar way as we've kind of learned the dichotomy of Nika through the giants of Elbaf. So all of this, I think, sets them up as allies long-term. And while we're continuing on this train of what I think is kind of obvious thoughts, the other one is that by the conclusion of the story, Luffy's allies. Luffy is going to be the leader of this force that is going to encompass pretty much the entire world. Wild tangent here, but of all the Yonko commanders that we've met, Katakuri by far is my favorite. I am totally convinced that the Big Mom Pirates will do this exact same thing and eventually join the Grand Fleet, and I cannot wait for that to happen. But yeah, talking about Yonko commanders is actually kind of on topic here for the actual chapter, as we got more of Luffy, Zoro, and Scopper Gaban. One of the things that I appreciate most about Oda's storytelling is his ability to get creative. And I'm not saying what happened in this chapter is the most creative thing ever, but when you have a story that is going on for as long as One Piece, being able to have an identity to it, an appeal, a consistent appeal, but also be able to execute this in slightly different ways is so impressive. I guess the best way that I would explain this is, think about this as a gamer. A lot of us have genres of games that we know that we like. And on the surface, if you're not a fan of these genres, you can look at one game and all the other games in the same genre and be like, oh, that's the same game. But to anybody who loves it, you can tell the difference. The nuance, the little moments of creativity create a new experience that can leave you playing essentially the same framework for a very long time. So basically what I'm saying is, it would have been so easy for Oda to just make Scopper Gaban essentially the same as Rayleigh, because we already know that Rayleigh works. Honestly, I think that many fans would have liked this. But instead of Oda giving us exactly what he knows we already like, he attempts to give us something new. And long term, the story is way better for it. But yeah, if you've noticed, we've now met 5 former members of the Roger Pirates, and all 5 of them are totally different from one another, both in terms of their character, but also their interactions, moments in the story. Kind of like how Buggy and Shanks are total foils of each other. Like, think about how competent and strong Shanks is, compare that to Buggy. Think about what Shanks values compared to Buggy. They're opposites. In a similar way, I see the same thing between Scopper and Rayleigh. Just aside from them being different characters and that having value, because we don't want every character to literally be the same, but aside from that, like, the actual experience of meeting Rayleigh was awesome, but it was like totally different from what's happening now. Both Rayleigh and Scopper had tests for these strats, but Rayleigh's test was he asked them a question. I know the entire history of the world. If you want to know, I can tell you. That was a test. Meanwhile, Scopper is not so nuanced. Seems to me he basically wanted to find out if these dudes are actually as strong as they're supposed to be, to do what Roger could not. Also may have just wanted to push Luffy to use Gear 5th to see if the white form was real. So maybe the way that I would frame this is Rayleigh was interested to know who the strats were as people, where Scopper is interested to know what they can do as fighters. But through this, we end up with a very similar appeal, which is just simply the fact that you have a former member of the Roger Pirates who is insanely strong and gets to showcase that strength. But their relationship with the strats couldn't have been any more opposite. Scopper Gaban in this chapter literally attempted to kill Luffy. Honestly, if we're comparing Scopper to anybody, it'd be Kuma at the end of Thriller Bark, because that's what this felt like. But anyway, I had a point to all this, which is just like, look, Scopper Gaban has a lot of similarities here with Buggy of just being a pseudo-enemy of the strats. The second Roger Pirate like this. It's like an amalgamation of Rayleigh and Buggy. And I really enjoyed it. And I also think this is exactly where the story needed to go. It's not the pre-time skip anymore. Luffy doesn't need to be trained by a mentor figure. So Scopper here is really just acting as a final test to confirm that, Rayleigh's training worked. Fan service in the best way for those that want to see a matchup between Luffy and Rayleigh now. But yeah, I said at the beginning that I thought that this chapter might be a little controversial, and I think that the Scopper and Strat fight is a big reason why. The fight at first was awesome, but then we turn the pages and it requires both Luffy and Zoro to team up before Scopper is defeated, but he isn't actually defeated, he just gives up before anything else happens. I really don't think that that's what fans were looking for from this fight. I think that if you'd asked people beforehand if they thought that Scopper Gaban would defeat Luffy, one, people wouldn't have believed that, and two, people wouldn't have wanted that. So I feel as if for some fans, this fight left a bad taste in our mouths. On top of being unresolved, what is explicitly implied is not what people wanted. So with this being said, I just want to interject with some narrative control. We already know that you need to control your emotional state in order to use Haki properly. This was discussed, showcased in the Luffy versus Katakuri fight. So the way that I saw the fight is that first we began and Luffy was not taking it seriously. And I don't think that he was taking it seriously because look, this old guy that they don't know anything about suddenly, all of this is very sudden. And we know that Luffy didn't immediately go into Gear 5th or even Gear 4th. So he was not anticipating this being a challenge. Obviously, additive with the fact that he did not know that this was Scopper Gaban of the Roger Pirates. So he takes a few lumps because he's not taking the fight seriously. Then, he is taking it seriously. But the issue is that he is fighting mad. He's fighting mad because of Shanks. Scopper basically insulted him. You fight mad, it affects your Haki, and it seems like Haki is really what was being tested here. So Luffy takes a few more lumps, and at this point it feels like Scopper is just straight up winning. But I personally think it's a little bit misleading. In my mind, this fight was legit for only one singular moment. One attack, that was it. That was the only time in which we were really seeing what both people could do. Luffy dodged the attack, and it seems as though Scopper was satisfied with that. So I don't want to hear any slander about how Luffy needed Zoro's help to defeat Scopper. None of that. Auto ban in the comments. Once Luffy dodged the attack, the fight was over. But actually, to walk this back just a little bit, Scopper did acknowledge that Luffy needed Zoro's help. Not to actually fight, but Zoro's warning. You guys already know that I'm full of controversial Zoro takes, and we shared some of these in the last chapter review, which I read the comments, guys. I understand many of you do not like this, and I get it, right? I'll talk about what I want to talk about anyway, but having that conversation before this chapter, I think, is important. In my opinion, this is how you better understand the story. Because in that chapter review, we talked about how it's my opinion that the strats don't really have a true vice captain. Every Straw Hat has their area of expertise, and Luffy knows when to listen to them when their advice matters, based on their particular strengths. When it comes to storms and navigating, he listens to Nami. When it comes to medicine and doctoring stuff, he listens to Chopper, so on and so forth. I believe every single Straw Hat at some point or another, maybe not all of them, but you see this commonly, there's different Straw Hats that take a commanding role depending on circumstance. A lot of people have this narrative that Zoro is the vice captain because he's the second strongest, and I'm not really with it. So in my opinion, this naturally leads into the question of, okay, well, what can Zoro do that Luffy cannot? All the way back to the Arlong Park arc, right? Luffy made this speech of he relies on his crew members because there's many things that he cannot do. And for a lot of these Straw Hats, it's very obvious what this is. For Zoro, it is less so. So in the last chapter review, we talked about trust. Luffy is very trusting, while as a polar opposite to this, Zoro is very distrustful. But the interesting thing about this thing that Zoro can do that Luffy can't is that more often than not, it does not pan out or amount to anything. You go back and reread the end of Alabasta and the beginning of Skypiea, how distrustful Zoro was of Robin, and in hindsight, right, he's taken an L there. This happens repeatedly throughout the story. And at the same time, we're talking about things that these Strats can do for Luffy, and that Luffy listens to them when it's their area of expertise, but in the case of trusting people, Luffy has not ever really trusted Zoro. And I would say that it has worked out for the better. So it does not appear as if Luffy has delegated this responsibility to him. I would say that this is the noteworthy exception of Luffy's speech in Arlong Park, where he recognizes that he cannot do anything and that he relies on his crew, because just the same as in Elbaf here with Loki, Luffy is going to free him, and he does sort of trust him to talk about or know about Shanks. And all of this is going to unfold regardless of Zoro's opinion. So yeah, I think that this aspect of Zoro's character and relationship with Luffy is, one, interesting, but two, important. But it remains debatable. We'll see if Oda has twists and turns for this particular dynamic as we continue. Maybe, this is actually a valued skill that will come up and be proven at some point in time. But with all this context in mind, this chapter definitively clarifies what Zoro can do for Luffy, and that is essentially remain serious. It is not a coincidence that in the definitive moment of this battle, Zoro has a warning, and I think it's implied that Luffy listened. If he had not, he might be dead. Also, strangely, this also reminds me of Big Mom and Kaido's relationship, because Big Mom issued a warning to Kaido in the very same way when Zoro attacked him, basically told Kaido to dodge. It's almost like the exact same thing. So again, if we come back to the question of what is Zoro's strength, what is his area of expertise, that's very obviously combat. Again, it's implied that he saw the danger of this attack before Luffy. And I'd guess he saw it because he never dropped his guard, which is who our boy Zoro is. The fact that Scopper made a point to acknowledge all of this it's all thematic. It's kind of the point. Luffy doesn't just need Zoro for his individual strength and fighting prowess. The fact that one day he's going to be a legendary fighter, if not already. I think that what Oda is saying is that Zoro, more than any other Straw Hat, keeps Luffy focused when serious threats arrive. And frankly, I feel like you can even apply this conversation to Loki. How much did Luffy really consider anything that he was doing with Loki before he had a conversation with Zoro? In this case, what happens afterwards, even if Loki becomes a friend or it doesn't end up being a bad thing to free him, whatever it might be, it's kind of irrelevant. It seems to argue that the purpose of it isn't for Zoro to change Luffy's mind. It's to make sure that he understands the danger, so he doesn't take it lightly. You can even go back to Zou and Whole Cake Island. We had a similar moment between Zoro and Luffy there, where Zoro warned Luffy to not go after Sanji because doing so would provoke Big Mom when they were already at war with Kaido. I was very critical of Zoro for this, because getting Sanji back is essential, and it seemed as though Zoro was trying to make that not happen. But now you can look at it in maybe a slightly different way. Think about Luffy's frame of mind as he entered Whole Cake Island, all of the plans and stuff that they conceived and whatnot. Zoro's warning had an effect there as well. All of this seems to be Oda's way of discussing precisely Zoro's value to the crew, aside from literally being really strong. This is why we have these conversations, because this story is outright suggesting that there is more that we do not fully understand. But yeah, all of this aside, I really did want Luffy to get a blow or two in on Scopper, which didn't really happen, and for me that was a little bit disappointing. Maybe the rationale from Oda's standpoint is that Scopper played a role on the Roger Pirates similar to Zoro for Luffy. He was the guy who took battle seriously. And so then it would make sense for him to basically say, hey look, I'm out, the moment that he senses danger was imminent for himself. they were gonna kill him. Just like Zoro, he has a talent for sensing this and was like, peace? Which again is thematically relevant. He dodged the attack the only way that he could, by surrendering. This also, I think, reaffirms something that we said when we first met Scopper, is everyone's knee-jerk reaction is that Scopper is very similar to Sanji because of the whole love thing, right? And I made an argument like there's aspects of Scopper's character that also remind me of Zoro. So I feel like Scopper is really a combination of different traits from Sanji and Zoro. So we had a mini flashback in the chapter where Shanks was meeting Scopper and obviously talking about Luffy, and what Scopper says strikes a chord with me. He says, "You really think I'd trust him that easily?" So we're talking about a guy who is perhaps very distrustful, like Zoro. So now that we talked about this, there's another element of this chapter which might be disappointing to some people. Essentially, at the end of the chapter, we see that Gunko and Shamrock are summoning new members of the God's Knights to actually do the kidnapping of the giant children. Maybe some of you out there might expect me to talk about the pentacle power or whatever the hell is going on, and I do want to talk about it, but I'm just going to be straight up with you guys. I do not understand what this is or how this works. Well, let's just be upfront about that. I feel like I would ramble in circles for minutes and not actually come to any definitive conclusions, so we're just going to skip it. I just want to point out that this pentacle technology power is weird. But what we did learn for a fact is that not everybody can actually utilize the pentacles. It requires specific conditions. So they can't just nab giant children, create a pentacle, and then zoom away. It's stated you need a mark, which frankly was necessary for narrative reasons because the power would be absurdly broken and unmanageable if it didn't have this restriction. But yeah, if you want a crazy conspiracy theory, the fact that you need a brand or a mark to use this, it reminds me of pirate tattoos. Just what it reminds me of. Like, as just an example, how every single member of the Whitebeard's pirates had a tattoo of Whitebeard's symbol. Actually, before I dig a hole for myself, I'm not entirely sure that every single member had it, but it was very common. This interrelates heavily with actual history as well as culture. I don't know if this is necessarily mandated, but it's just commonly known that members of the Navy, United States Navy or Marine Corps, often get tattoos related to their affiliation. Another thing which comes to mind is slave branding. If this is related to Imu's power and people have this symbol and can utilize these portals because of Imu, viewing them as slave brands might be on point. These are the direct servants of Imu and bear their symbol. But anyway, my tinfoil conspiracy theory is that the reason why, for instance, the Whitebeard pirates have this tradition of tattooing their symbol onto the backs of crew members and subordinates is because potentially if this is related to Imu's devil fruit, potentially, all of this goes back to a time where this power was commonly used. Actually, I suppose this also works if this isn't a devil fruit ability, but just some kind of different technology. But the way that I imagine it in my mind is just imagine for a second, you have a world of pirates burgeoning with Joy Boy, perhaps. Then you potentially have a crew of people bearing this symbol as their enemy. And though the world has forgotten exactly what's happened, this tradition has kind of survived over time. But obviously not with strange powers attached. But yeah, so ultimately Gunko ends up summoning Saint Summers of the Shepherd family and Saint Quinglingem of the Limosiv family, both of who are immediately interesting characters. But their reveal comes with the disappointment of orders from above that Shamrock needs to leave and go back to Mary Joie because something is happening in the Holy Land. So yeah, if you were looking for it, I have some more cope for you. Regardless of what this chapter says or implies, I don't think that Shamrock is done in Elbaf. It would just feel like a very weird thing to do. But my opinion also has something to do with the very end of the chapter. Shamrock says we could make a game out of this. And it immediately reminds me of two things. It reminds me of God Valley, and it also reminds me of Skypiea. But yeah, the whole backdrop of God Valley is that the Celestial Dragons selected this place to have their games, hunting games. So you should be thinking about how the events in this arc might mirror God Valley. And one thing that I'm pretty well convinced will happen is by the conclusion of this arc, Elbaf will vanish. It'll get destroyed. We've also brought up how Scopper Gaban seems likely to be the man marked by flames, and we've seen various pirate crews characters talk about the man marked by flames and kind of are seeking him as an objective. Among these is the Blackbeard Pirates. And it would make a ton of sense for Blackbeard to arrive in Elbaf anyway because this is likely where the last road poneglyph he needs is. So we have a version of the Celestial Dragons hunting game taking place in Elbaf involving the actual gods' knights. And we have two pirates that might play important roles, Luffy and Blackbeard. Sounds a lot like God Valley. It would therefore be very strange for Shamrock, the son of Garling, to not play the role of his father Garling in God Valley. It would just be weird to me. So yeah, it's not a coincidence that the Celestial Dragons and Emu are the gods of the world, and that they are heavily paralleled with Enel and Skypiea. Enel also had his version of the hunting games during that arc. Elbaf is also a sky island, so I'm expecting some heavy parallels to Skypiea. But the way that fight in Skypiea worked is that Enel essentially set his minions out as obstacles, and if you overcome all the obstacles, then you get to face him. In my opinion, Oda is recreating this same vibe here in Elbaf. Once the Straw Hats defeat all of the minions, then they will be able to face Shamrock. I'm gonna die on this hill. If Shamrock can leave in a moment, he can arrive in a moment. And if he's planning on making some sort of game, it would also suggest that he would be aware of the events that are happening in Elbaf so he could follow along. Just my read of the situation, but Shamrock doesn't seem like a guy who tolerates failure, especially as this is supposed to be his mission. But yeah, I just want to make sure that I say this. Summers and Keelingen, I'm going to call him St. Q. But immediately, these are borderline likable characters. I've seen some people feel a certain way about this because these are Celestial Dragons. Celestial Dragons that we know are definitively the bad guys, but look, this is just how it is in the story of One Piece. Like, people aren't bad. There is no group of people in the entire world that are all collectively evil. But people can believe things that are not true, and that can be bad. In this case, the Celestial Dragons believe themselves to be God and believe humans to be lesser than them. And that's why their actions collectively have led to a lot of evil. But it doesn't make them inherently evil people. This to me is most of the point of having Shamrock and Shanks be twins. Most likely they are genetically identical, and Shanks is obviously a good guy. So the story of One Piece is less about killing people and more about killing ideologies or beliefs, which feels like a perspective somebody from Japan might have a little bit more easily than other places considering their history. So yeah, long story short is, don't be surprised that Oda is humanizing the Celestial Dragons. They are in fact people, regardless of how eccentric they might be. And honestly, like, immediately, it's their eccentricities which make them so likable. I'm reminded of one of my favorite villains of all time from Skypiea, Gidatsu. But if you don't remember, he was one of Enel's priests, and his whole character stick was that he forgot to do things that most people don't have to think about, like blinking, where to put his arms, or breathing. So honestly, I hope that these guys are anywhere near as wacky as Gidatsu, because Gidatsu is a legend. But yeah, essentially, Summers is a couch potato. He's kind of lazy, while St. Q seems to be a little nervous. He's kind of a worrywart. Mad assistant vibes. This might also explain why St. Q arrived already transformed into his animal form. Guy is ready to go. Immediately, I know that these characters will deliver some entertainment, and I'm here for it. But anyway, just some closing thoughts about the chapter. I know we skipped over this when it was relevant to discuss, but Luffy got mad when Scopper Gaban criticized Shanks. And it's kind of a reminder that Luffy as an adult is really not that different from Luffy as a child. He is fiercely protective of Shanks's honor. Should remind you of Chapter 1 and Shanks and the Bandits, which also made Luffy extremely mad that Shanks would just allow them to do that. So this is about pride, and pride has a lot to do with the Giants of Elbaf. If you go back and you reread Little Garden, the Giants' pride really centers around the island of Elbaf themselves. They have a lot of pride in Elbaf, and it seems related to me that Luffy's pride is not really about himself. It's about the person that he respects, Shanks. In my opinion, this will go somewhere. It's also really interesting to me that Scopper Gaban does not want Road to reveal his identity, and he also says, like, by the conclusion of this arc, come find me. The Strats are like, well, we have no reason to want to find you, so shove off. But it gives me the impression that Scopper's not going to be really involved in the battle here. He may just want to observe, which would be significant if true. But probably the most significant tiny detail from this chapter, which stands out to me, is that when the God's Knights were summoned, they didn't actually understand or know what the mission would be. And they asked this question of like, what are we doing in a non-member nation like this? And then they say, as if this is the only idea that makes sense, were you visiting Harold's grave or something? I'm not gonna lie to you guys, I don't like this, because I think that Oda has made it too obvious. This all but confirms that the God's Knights were involved with Harold. Either that or this line will amount to nothing and we'll have a different reason to be upset about it. Look man, it's really straightforward. Why would the God's Knight's knee-jerk reaction be, oh, we're here, what would the reason be? Oh, because you might be visiting King Harold's grave. Like, in what ways could this make sense? And unfortunately, the ways are very few, unless Oda has cooked up something crazy wild. But yeah, from this day henceforth until it is confirmed otherwise, I am 100% under the impression that King Harold was working directly with the God's Knights, and he was in fact the bad guy. The Loki redemption agenda has never been stronger. There's also a lot of social commentary in this if this is the case. I feel like I quoted Sun Tzu The Art of War recently, but like, the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. And if the Celestial Dragons influenced King Harold to make the country of Elbaf pacifist as a subversive tactic, then that's what, that would be fitting. I don't know exactly how much into the rabbit hole I want to go because this conversation is incredibly political. But just know that this kind of thing basically defines warfare since the 1950s, the Cold War to present day. This is how the majority of consequential wars are fought, and much has been made of this recently in the news. Essentially, a lot of what people believe, they believe because it was in the interest of enemy governments, intended to make us weaker and sow discord. But yeah, I'm really not gonna get into it today. Just know that there's a lot of real-world inspiration here for what seems to be happening. And personally, it's just sad to me that when you finally understand that literally everything is propaganda, what do you believe then? You're just forced to think for yourself and hope that you're good at it. But I would say the most difficult thing to puzzle out about King Harold potentially being a traitor to Elbaf is what exactly is his motivation. And the only thing which immediately comes to mind is that King Harold believed he had to fool the people for them to believe that he was the sun god. And whether or not he was the sun god was irrelevant, he wanted that position in society. The other thing which comes to mind is that maybe King Harold was afraid of fighting. So he needed help changing the culture of Elbaf because of his own personal fears. But yeah, this would also make you think differently about the reason that Mother Carmel was allowed into Elbaf. Now you wonder whether King Harold was in on the abduction of giants. Believe it or not, something like this could actually be justified, and King Harold internally didn't view himself as a traitor to the island. Something like, oh, we just want the giants to assimilate them into our society to prepare Elbaf to be welcome to the rest of the world. But yeah, I am actually really excited to see where this is going. And even if we I think know now that Harold has a relationship with the God's Knights, there's still many ways that Oda could take it that I think would subvert our expectations in good ways. While a lot of people are gonna take this, I think, as like confirmation that King Harold was evil, I doubt it. My gut feeling is that yes, King Harold was working with these Celestial Dragons, but he thought it was for the country's benefit. Essentially, they fooled him, which I think is also a theme of Elbaf. But anyway, guys, that's all I had to say today. Apologies for the lateness of the review, but better late than never. As always, I'm curious as to what you guys think, whether you know something from the chapter that I might have missed. Just share your thoughts. Also, break week for Azazel as well. I contemplated editing the video as replacement, but I just decided not to do that. Just ran out of time. But yeah, full disclosure, Azazel's going through some things right now. It's tough for him, so if you could spare some thoughts for him, that would be appreciated. If you're interested, check out my book, The Booms. Link is in the description. Like the video, subscribe, click the bell to be notified, join the squad, and as always, guys, have a wonderful day.